They say that dogs have been domesticated since like 50,000 years ago. And cats, my cats are around here, which is why we're filming outside today. I'll see if I can catch some of them in a later shot. Cats have been with us almost as long. But what if your world has things other than cats and dogs? What if you have fire-breathing pigeons? Would we still have done them as dirty as we did real-world pigeons? Or would it have been a magnificent renaissance of pigeon domestication? That is what I want to talk about today. Domestication in a fantasy world and how it affects your plot and your story. Welcome to another episode of Creating Fantasy Species from Just-in-Time World Building with your host, Marie Mullaney. So this is my cat Asura, and I brought her so that we can talk about the difference between domestication and taming. So, I don't know if the mic will pick that up. So, domestication is when we deliberately make changes to the animal, right? So, this is where we implement, or the plant, because we'll talk about plants as well. This is where we implement an actual change in their gene structure, and we change the way the animal is configured and so on. Like with dogs, they started out as wolves with kind of ears, and then over time their ears became floppy and they became smaller or bigger. They became hunters as we selected for specific traits. Okay. Taming is when you take a normal stock standard animal and you socialize them to be around humans. You tame that animal to be with humans. So this is if you were to take like a tiger or a lion and tame it to allow you to interact with it. There are people who say cats aren't domesticated. To those people, I present the Persian cat. Seriously, we have done this poor creature so much harm. Some of them are so overbred that they can't breathe without help or an operation, which is a very clear case of humans fiddling with an animal. I think, though, to really bring the matter home to a fantasy context, we should talk about dune sandworms versus Anne McCaffrey's Dragons of Pern. Okay, so sandworms, for all that they don't seem very friendly to humans and can kill humans, have in a way been domesticated as part of the environment. They're part of this grand experiment that has been undertaken on Dune in order to enable people to live in it and see this greener future and so on. And so you have had sandworms somewhat changed as part of this. But at the same time, each individual sandworm, in order to be made use of, has to be tamed by the use of sand hooks, which are, you know, those big hooks that they use to pull up the scales and so on. So that is basically like an example of magic being used to temporarily tame an animal. You know, kind of the equivalent of, say, a D&D spell. Okay, contrast this with like a D&D familiar or a druid's companion in D&D, where you have an animal that is clearly tamed by magic. There is absolutely zero domestication going on here. You take a wild animal and you effectively use magic to tame it. And then the last fantasy example in this context is that of the Dragons of Pern. Now, Anne McCaffrey, when she constructed these dragons, she literally took the dragon, she literally had a geneticist manipulate the DNA of fire lizards to start the domestication process, to create these creatures with magic's equivalent, very advanced science, literal manipulation of genes, to make the fire lizards bigger, to make them rideable, to make them more domesticatable. And so the dragons became open to telepathic bonding, and they became bigger and capable of breathing fire and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are three kind of examples of taming and domestication in a fantastical concept. But before we move on to more fantasy applications of taming and domestication, I spoke about the traits that make taming possible. So let's unpack that in a little bit more detail. And here we will talk about plants and animals both and their domesticate-ability. Okay, so animals, pretty much Jared Diamond did great work on this in Guns, Germs, and Steel. The rest, a lot of the book is kind of iffy, but the work he did on domestication of animals was great. My baby, Asura, come here, baby. Yes, he's a little tiger. You are. All right, so let's talk about what makes these little guys domesticatable. So there's a mnemonic that people call the F's of domestication for animals, and it goes like this. The first F is fast growth. Okay, so this is the animal reaches maturity quickly. And this is one of the reasons why elephants haven't really been domesticated. We tame individual elephants. They're more like sandworms than anything else. They're tamed for use, but they're not fully domesticated because they don't reach maturity fast, right? It's a 2-year pregnancy cycle, then it's 15 years till they can be used and so on. And I mean, half a human lifetime has passed at that point. So yeah, generally speaking, it needs to have a reasonably fast lifetime. It needs to be a fast to maturation effect. The second F is friendly. It needs to be naturally less aggressive to humans. When you're looking at something like a lion or something like that, the problem with lions are they look at humans and they see prey, right? So you're going to end up in a situation where you have a domesticated animal that literally looks at your children as something good to eat. And that doesn't make for great domestication. Our third F is flexible diet. Okay? Pure carnivores tend not to make the best domestication options. Even dogs will eat some vegetables and so on. Now, cats are an exception to that, of course. And as I said, there are people who say they're not domesticated. But cats also are pretty friendly to us. And they don't require much care, which is why their domestication, I think, was a good option, because a cat will generally cope without too much attention. Then they need to be fecund, which is to say they reproduce easily and frequently in captivity. No pandas. Pandas can't be domesticated. It is too hard to get them to actually breed. Then they need to have a family structure. They need to have a herd or pack behavior where they follow a leader. This is so that a human can basically take the place of that leader. And because they take the place of that leader, they get to lead the pack and dominate the whole structure. And then they need to be not too flighty. They need to be not excessively skittish or panicky. This is why we haven't domesticated antelope. Antelope are very skittish, they're very panicky, and they jump very high so they can escape kind of captivity very easily. So those are kind of the F's of animal domesticate-ability. So if you have an animal in your world and it doesn't fit any of those Fs, probably won't be domesticated. But if it fits some of those Fs, it probably can be domesticated, or if it fits all of them, it definitely can be. And if you want to take some of our world's animals and make them domesticatable in your world, then you just need to alter some behavior. So, for example, I made antelopes domesticatable in my world on the continent of Kisangani just by removing some of their flightiness and removing some of their jumpability, right? So I made them slightly more friendly because they are already fairly friendly towards humans. They are already fecund. They are already in a family structure. All of those are there. It's just a few traits that need to be altered, which I then did to make them domesticatable. So that's your rules for animals. But animals aren't the only thing we've domesticated. We've also domesticated plants. Wheat, strawberries, and so on are all examples of domesticated plants. And there are rules that I came up with for plants. Okay, so you won't find these in a textbook. This was all me. And it was actually my research for Worldbuilding Blueprints that I came up with these. P stands for plants. Okay. The first rule for plants is productivity. It must be highly productive, whether you measure this in calories or fibers or biomass. It is a primary driver of domestication. So your actual plant that you grow must be a very productive plant. Second one is palatability. It must have low toxicity and the absence of defensive chemicals. It must be something that humans can eat without feeling ill, and that humans can eat and that tastes not too tart and not too bitter. It must be predictable. It must have uniform ripening and reduced dormancy. So you're not looking for something that gets ripe in a staggered way over weeks. You're looking for something that is ripe within like a day or two, or the whole field is ripe within a day or two, so that you can very predictably plan your harvest. It must have prolific reproduction. So again, like you can't have pandas, you need to have plants that reproduce easily in a human-managed system. And that also ties in with passive seed dispersal. It needs to have non-shattering seed heads in your cereals and things like that. And this is so that humans can gather those seeds quite easily, and taking the seeds can then replant additional plants using it. And the plants must have plasticity, which is basically that it just responds well to selective breeding. So it must have the ability, it must have genetic or phenotype plasticity, which allows humans to select for novel traits. So basically, like you're like, I like this trait in the plant, and I can breed for more of that trait. It needs a perennial or a practical lifespan. So it needs to either every year be able to harvest a crop at least, or it needs to be something which, if it does grow dormant, still produces fruits every year. Another way to put this is it must fit within the human cultivation cycle. I considered calling this the planting cycle compatibility, but that seemed like a bit of a mouthful. And then just a couple of bonus ones is it must have a limited protection. So, you don't want too many thorns and so on to deal with. And it is better if it is not fully sensitive to day length, so that it can be planted in like places like here where we have light a lot in summer but almost none in winter. It can also thrive in places where the day length is more or less the same. So Those are the trays that plants and animals use. I want to talk about one last thing to consider in domestication, and that is the dual use, especially of animals. Okay, so what do I mean by dual use? Most animals that we've domesticated have two uses within their domestication framework, right? So goats, for example, are used for their meat, their milk, and their hides. Cattle are used for milk, meat, and labor. Dogs are used for herding and guarding and companionship. You can see that if one of these fail for whatever reason, the others still keep the animal with us, still keep the animal useful. Now, one of the animals I left off the list there is pigs. Pigs are used for meat and they're used for waste disposal. Okay, they eat almost anything. So they are very useful in a city context where they can just clean up wasted food, especially in kind of the Bronze Age era. But when you don't have a vast city kind of environment, what happens is your pigs stop being as useful, and they're very unuseful in a nomadic context, which is why in our archaeological record of domestication, pigs have been domesticated twice. They were domesticated when we had the big kind of original Neolithic and early Bronze Age cities. Then after the Bronze Age collapse caused by the sea peoples and the changing climate and so on and so forth, what happened was people's economy shrunk to almost nothing, right? And the people became more nomadic, and the cities were gone, the big cities were gone, many of them. So the domestication of pigs fell off a cliff because they weren't useful anymore. They only had one purpose now, and that was meat. But as the city started building up again, you see the consumption of pigs once again pick up because people settle down. Pigs are easy to domesticate within a larger environment. Pigs make for good eating and they help you with waste disposal in your cities. And so that is why we later redomesticated pigs. So think about dual use in any animals that you create for domestication. Okay, so before we delve into the fantasy aspect of this, I do just briefly want to tell you about Worldbuilding Blueprints. We are in the final week of the Kickstarter. This is it. If you don't back it within this week, you won't back it within the Kickstarter period. Worldbuilding Blueprints is a book that I wrote that summarizes all of the information that I shared on the podcast Worldbuilding Blueprints over the past year. It gathers together models for building your economy, your fantasy level, your culture, and it gives you a zero to hero world building approach to building a comprehensive, fantastical world. It has over 50 exercises, and it has got practical worksheets included in it to help you build out your world building Bible. When you back it, you can choose between a hardback laid out in full color, a paperback laid out in black and white, or even the digital version as a color PDF. So, if you're interested in world building, if you found value in my videos, hit the links down below, go to the Kickstarter and back World Building Blueprints today. Okay, let's talk fantasy domestication. So, the first thing we need to discuss is the difference that fantasy makes to domestication. Now, we've spoken briefly about how you can alter an animal's domesticate-ability or a plant's domesticate-ability by changing the traits associated with them. But that is not the only impact that fantasy can have. You can also use magic to create domestication or to tame an animal. So there are three ways in which magic can help you with domestication. Obviously, magic can help you a great deal with taming. It can literally create a tamed animal out of a normal animal, like with a familiar that we spoke about in D&D, or with like a spell with which you tame an animal and so on. So it can create a tamed bond. I mean, if I think about Horizon Zero Dawn, you have that thing you jab into one of the robots and then you can ride them, you know, those mechanical life forms. So it's kind of like that, right? So you can temporarily tame an animal with magic in a fantasy world. But magic can also affect domestication. It can bypass or lower natural barriers to domestication. So let's say the animal is very flighty, magic could make the animal less flighty. Or let's say the animal is not fecund, it could help the animal become more fecund. Or let's say the plant has got explosive seed dispersal. Magic could create containers to catch those seeds and make replanting the plant easier and thus encourage domestication of that plant. Magic can also help you with accelerated breeding. But of course, that is assuming that you're going to go through like a breeding cycle and so on, a normal domestication cycle. Magic can literally speed up domestication by altering genes with magic, right? This is what Anne McCaffrey did with Dragon Riders of Pern. There was a geneticist who used very, very advanced genetics, essentially magic, and manipulated the fire lizard genes to create dragons from them, to make them larger and more domesticatable, like straight out the box. Just straight up magic to skip over whole generations of domestication and reach the point where they were large enough to carry humans. So that is what magic can do for you. And we spoke about using just altering traits of standard animals. So as I said, I did this in Kisangi, where I had antelopes and I made those antelopes less flighty. But I also implemented some of this in Imovin. Now, in Imovin, it required a bit more thought. And that's because what I wanted in Imovin was I wanted to use terror birds. Now, I know terror birds don't exist anymore, but that's not going to stop me. I'm a fantasy world builder. I can use anything I find cool. So I used terror birds in Imovin as a domesticated animal. Now, terror birds presented me with two problems that I had to deal with. The first was quite easy. They were meat eaters. So I had to make them omnivorous, right? So I made them fruit and meat eaters in my world, these terror birds equivalents, so that humans could still feed them in the same way that humans feed pigs. They had two uses straight off the bat, because they could be used to pull carriages, and they could be ridden, and they could be used to eat, obviously, you know, being birds. So all of that was great. But they're also very dangerous to humans. So what I did was I built into these terror birds a strong familial pack mentality and an imprinting mentality based on like the way that birds in our world imprint on their parents, right? So we have, you know, that's where the story of the ugly duckling comes from, the swan that thought they were a duck, you know, they imprint on what they see. And so I made these terror birds in the same way, imprintable. And if they are hatched by a human, they imprint on the human as their family leader. And so that is how I overcame the taming constraint on what would normally be something that wouldn't necessarily be tameable and therefore would really struggle to be domesticatable. Because if you can't tame it, you definitely can't domesticate it, right? Except through magic, obviously. So that is taming and domestication in both in our world and how you can use it in a fantasy world and how you can adapt it to your world building. And of course, what it offers you is a myriad plot elements. You know, you can have animals that people are attached to. You can have pets, you can have mounts, you can create a whole different farming environment that really helps transport your reader to your fantasy world. What's your favorite domestication of a fantastical animal or domestication of an animal we have that we haven't domesticated? Let me know in the comments below. And if you don't have a favorite, just leave a cat or a dog emoji to let me know if you're a cat person or a dog person. And while you're down there, do remember to subscribe, because in the next episode of this series, we are going to talk about the specifics of creating artificial life, life that isn't born of biology, and all of the ways that you can use that as a plot element. Nature being very active right there. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. It really does help grow the show. And thank you very much to all of the members of my channel who make this possible and whose support give me financial stability. If you want to help the channel, a great and free way to do it is just to watch another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, you will probably enjoy my video on fungi, which I'll put on the screen right there, or you can pick whatever the algorithm is presenting to you right now. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.